Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first part of Chapter 10, which is Personality and Social Influence. Personality and social influence is the beginning of the distinction between personality psychology and social psychology. I want to thank Dr. Scott Roberts, who helped me with a lot of these slides. A lot of these are his. The good ones are his anyway. So he was one of my colleagues at the University of Maryland. So thanks, Scott. I appreciate it. All right. We are going to talk about personality and social influence today. And we're going to start with the idea of what's the distinction between personality psychology and social psychology. So there's this famous idea which is a distinction in all of psychology, that things happen for one of two reasons. That either it happens because of your personality, who you are, or the environment that you're in, your social situation. And the distinction between personality and social psychology is basically that distinction. Personality psychology says you do things because of the personality, your own personality traits, your disposition, who you are. Social psychology says we underestimate the amount that our environment, the situation that we're in, influences our decisions. In reality, it's a mixture of both, and it depends on what's going on. But certainly, this is true, and that is that we often underestimate the amount of social influence, meaning the environmental influence, the social situation. Now, to be fair, I'm a trained social psychologist, so I'm a little bit biased here, but there's a whole lot more social psychology going on than personality psychology. When you're thinking about personality psychology, you're probably thinking about taking personality tests, etc., and that's part of it. But in reality, if you're going to take a personality psychology class, you're probably going to learn a lot about Sigmund Freud and his colleagues and some other things. So personality psychology really talks a lot about Sigmund Freud because Freud talks about how your disposition, what's going on inside of you, your personality, will affect your actions, your behaviors. So we're going to start by talking about Freud. This, okay, now remember, Freud is important historically. That doesn't mean that we all necessarily believe today what Freud was laying down. Anyway, so Freud's concept of the human psyche goes in this idea of the conscious versus the unconscious. Now, we've talked about this iceberg metaphor. So this whole thing is an iceberg, right? So what you're aware of is up here in the conscious. Underneath, this is all part of you and it is processing, it's happening, you're just not aware of it, and it's really influencing you. That's the preconscious and the unconscious, right? So all this together we call the subconscious. And then this is the non-conscious. Don't worry about that too much. But the preconscious is what's called the superego. The ego is going on all throughout this whole thing, and the id is in the pure unconscious. So if you ever heard of somebody talk about their ego, yeah, it's not the same ego. It's not the same idea. So basically, you think about this kind of like, I gotta be careful saying this because it's not exactly true, but kind of like those shoulder angels that you see in movies, right? So the id, these are your basic, like animalistic kind of desires, the desire to kill and have sex and just do all of those animalistic things. That's your id. Your id is trying to make you do those things. Your super ego is based on what society wants you to do, what's appropriate, what's proper. And your ego is trying to regulate between those two things, the superego and the id, and trying to figure out what's going on. So the ego is kind of like you in the middle of the angel and the devil trying to figure out, hey, which way should I go? And so what we're saying is that Freud thinks that we have a constant drive, the id that's going on, and the basic drive there is a sexual drive, but there's also a violence drive, an aggression drive that's going on. And then we're also trying to balance that, and that creates a lot of tension that's going on unconsciously. We're not aware of it, and that can then ex express itself in our behaviors later on. Carl Jung is a student of Freud, so Jung is Jungian psychology. So Jung also believed in this idea of the conscious and unconscious, but he broke it down a little bit different way. So Jung thought that we still have this unconscious going on, but he separated into what's called a personal unconscious and then a collective unconscious. Now, this is strange. I know that you're like, what? What are you talking about? But he believed that we specifically, by ourselves, we have our own personal unconscious. That's kind of like the tension that Freud was talking about, kind of like that. But then also we share a collective unconscious. That is, our society shares an idea of what should or shouldn't be going on, a script or an expectation of what should or shouldn't be happening. It's called the collective unconscious. A personal unconscious, when there's tension there, we understand that in terms of like having complexes, right? If you ever heard of somebody having, oh, you've got a complex, they're talking about a Jungian complex. A collective unconscious is an idea of how people should act and what should happen. We think of these often in terms of archetypes. Let me tell you what I mean. So we, as a society, understand what should or shouldn't be happening, or what we would expect people's roles to be that might express themselves in the form of kind of a personality. So for example, these are examples of archetypes: the hero, the sidekick, the maiden, etc. These are collective expectations of what should or should be happening. So if you think about these different shows, then the hero might be someone like Luke Skywalker, and they have a specific role. And then we as a society expect them to do certain things, and that is what expresses in their personality and what they do. So collectively, we have these expectations called archetypes. So that you should fit into this role or that role. Individually, then we have tension in terms of a complex. That's according to Jung. Okay. When we measure our personalities, you've taken a million personality tests. Now, let me tell you something. Almost all of that is garbage. There's a lot of studies that have found that personality tests are really not very predictive of what happens. Often when we take personality tests, they're kind of like a horoscope where you can kind of see almost anything in what's happening. And you're like, oh, yeah. Oh, so you get a personality test, you take it, and it says, you are a patient and kind person. You're like, yeah, that's right. I am. I am a patient and kind person. That's true. And then you do a different personality test that says, you are ambitious and can't be stopped in your goals. You're like, yeah, that's right. I do have goals. And I do want, yeah, I can't be stopped. You often see whatever you want to see in whatever personality test you happen to be taking. That's even for scientific ones, or ones that seem scientific. So, for example, the Myers-Briggs personality test, it's actually not very predictive in terms of behaviors. It's not very good. Some of the worst personality tests, I got to be careful with that. Personality tests, traditionally, when people have thought about personality tests, they've often thought about projective measures. For example, the Rorschach inkblot test. The purpose of the Rorschach inkblot test is you are supposed to project your personality onto this ambiguous stimulus. So an ink blot is just that. It's a bunch of ink. It's not supposed to look like anything. And the test was that people would say, all right, look at this ink blot and then tell me what it is. So somebody might project their personality. That's why it's called a projective measure. Project their personality on the ink blot. So one person might look at this and say, oh, well, this is two people hugging each other and they're trying to work out their differences. Another person says, oh, this is a man who is staring at me and who is angry, right? Either way, you're projecting what's inside of your unconscious onto this particular ink blot. Another projective measure is called the TAT, the thematic apperception task. Instead of giving a totally ambiguous stimulus like an ink blot, you are given an ambiguous situation. So obviously you know that this is a person. Unlike this, you don't know what that is. It's just an ink blot. But you know this is a person, and you know that's a woman, right? And so instead of saying, hey, what is this? You say, what is going on here? So you would project your personality. The idea is you project your personality onto this particular situation. So one person might say, oh, well, this is a man and his wife, and he's getting up early in the morning so he can go to work and take care of his sick wife. Another person says, oh, well, that guy just killed her, and now he's feeling so guilty. You see how that's different? The situation is ambiguous, and we project our personality onto whatever the stimulus, whatever the situation happens to be. Now, unfortunately, projective measures are really subjective to the person who's interpreting them. So there's got to be somebody who says, all right, what does this mean? The psychologist saying that, and whatever's going on in that psychologist's brain is often how this is interpreted. So be careful with projective measures. Excuse me, but I sneeze. I did have to sneeze. Okay, there we go. These are defense mechanisms. Um, Freudian defense mechanisms. So these started with Freud, and there are certain things that we do and don't like about what happened with Freud. So, for example, today we don't really believe that the id and the superego and the ego are all working together and fighting each other. But we do believe that the subconscious does have an effect on what happens in our real behaviors. Defense mechanisms are things that were seen by Freud that people do in order to defend their self concept, the concept of who they are. Now, unlike some of the other stuff, there are a lot of these that really are quite important and do happen. So I'm not going to go through all of these necessarily, but I want you to be able to recognize some of the most important ones. So, for example, let's go through a few of them. Conversion. Conversion is an interesting defense mechanism. What happens, according to conversion, is when there's tension or problems psychologically going on, they get converted or changed into physical symptoms. So if somebody is feeling a lot of stress or tension because of a relationship, that might manifest itself in a physical symptom like a headache or a pain, literal pain in your neck, right? For example, actual physical pain. Denial is denial. People just deny whatever bad is happening, they deny it. Now remember, all of these are thought to be ways of defending your own self-perception, your own, well, in this case, your ego is what Freud thought. But basically, it's your good name for yourself. Let's skip down and talk about projection. So projection is when you project your problems onto other people, right? So if you are constantly nagging people, you often think that they're constantly nagging, that kind of thing. Rationalization, that's what it sounds like. You rationalize your specific ideas. Reaction formation is when you kind of do the opposite. This is like reverse psychology. So if I am really angry at my father, I might act very lovingly towards my father. Reaction formation. Um, Sublimation is the last one I want to talk about. This is a positive defense mechanism. So when you take tension that's going on and you transfer it into positive growth type behaviors. So all of these are ways that people defend against attacks on their perceptions, their self-concept. But in this particular case, they're defending it. Now, sometimes that's positive, sometimes that's negative. Often it is negative. Now, we do know that people do this kind of stuff, right? People do a lot of these things when they're trying to defend their self-concept. Let's talk about a totally different idea. So we need to talk about the idea of obedience. So let's talk about the contrast between personality and social psychology. So personality psychology happens because we do things because of who we are, right? Our personality traits. Whereas social psychology says we do things because of the social situation or the influences around us. Now, in this particular case, we want to talk about this is Adolf Eichmann. He was a Nazi SS captain, and he oversaw a lot of people who were killed in death camps during the Holocaust. And in 1961, he was convicted for crimes against humanity. Now, when we look at what Adolf Eichmann did, sent countless people to their death, that is the behavior. Why did he do it? Was it because he is an evil person? Well, that would be a personality explanation. Or was it because of the social situation that he was in? That would be a social psychology situation. Adolf Eichmann said that he never did anything, great or small, without obtaining an advance express instruction from Adolf Hitler or any of his superiors. So what he's saying is, hey, I am not an evil person. I was just following the social situation. I was being obedient to the situation that I was in. I really didn't have a choice. Now, in real life, both of those influence each other. I don't want to, and I certainly don't want to excuse any behavior even closely remotely associated with the Holocaust. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that we as humans often think that it's one or the other. In reality, it's a little bit of both. And certainly in this case, Eichmann was saying that I only did things because of the situation that I was in, not because of my personality. Well, just so that we know, this is not based off of just Nazis in Germany. We're talking also about behavior that happened in Americans. For example, This is William Calley, who ordered the murder of 500 civilians in Vietnam and was convicted of doing so in 1970. And when he was convicted, what was his defense? Well, his defense was, if you're asking why I did not stand up to them when I was given the orders, I'll say that I was a second lieutenant getting orders from my commander and I followed them foolishly, I guess. So in this case, he was following orders. He was saying this is a social situation, that he was just obeying orders. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't his personality. It was the obedience of the social situation. Well, situations like this gave rise to a study by Stanley Milgram. Okay, this is the famous Milgram study. Stanley Milgram was a psychologist at this time. He was at Yale. Um, and this is the 1960s, so the trials for Nazi war crimes and things were going on at the time. And Milgram heard these and said, hey, is it really true that somebody would just be obeying orders? Could that actually be the case? Could it be that people who actually are nice, kind, they have a good personality, would do these awful things just because they were obeying an authority figure in that social situation? And so he created this study. And in this study, what he did is he brought people. In this case, he started off, he did lots of different iterations of it, and we'll talk about some of those in just a minute. But he brought in people from the community. He didn't want students. He wanted, just normal people to come in from the community. And they were put in a situation, right? They came in and there was somebody with them. Now, the somebody with them was pretending to be another participant, another person who was participating in the study. In reality, that person was in on the study, was an actor. We call that a confederate in psychology, when somebody is pretending to be just part of the experiment or normal things and not, in on it. We call that person a confederate. What happens is the confederate was told that he would be the learner, and the actual participant was going to be the teacher. And the learner is connected to a shock machine. And in the other room, the teacher has to give certain words, and the learner has to say the word that's supposed to be connected. So there's random word pairings. The teacher says, "All right, house," and the learner has to say the correct word pairing, duck. Okay. If they get it wrong, then they get a shock. You start with a small shock, and then there's a scale of shocks that went all the way up to the end, which was I don't remember how many millivolts, but it was marked with how much it would hurt. So extreme shock, moderate shock, etc. Extreme shock, and then XXX. All right. Stanley Milgram went to a bunch of psychiatrists and said, all right, I got this study that we're going to do. What percent of the population are going to go all the way to the end? By the way, during this, the Confederate starts complaining about halfway through and says, hey, my heart's bothering me. This is really painful. Let me out, let me out, let me out. The researcher who's in the room with the teacher is saying, hey, you got to continue with the study. So basically, the researcher in the white lab coat is saying, you, the learner, you have to keep doing the study. At a certain point, the teacher right here is giving the shocks, and the learner in the other room, remember, that's an actor, says, my heart's bothering me, it's hurting me now, etc., and then stops responding at all. When that happens, the authority figure, the scientist, says, treat a non-response as an incorrect response, keep shocking. All right, so how many psychiatrists, he asked the psychiatrist, how many normal people are going to go all the way to the end with these shocks? Experts predicted only 1% would. So the idea here is the disposition, that's your personality. Disposition means personality. Would people overcome it? Who is responsible, right? So in this case, we need to talk about, this is the shock machine, by the way. This is what it looks like, right? And they go through, each incorrect response was, you go up one level of shock. Who's responsible? Is it me, the person who's actually giving the shocks, or is it the researcher? And so what's going on is the situation made people, the participants, say, hey, it's not my fault. The researchers told me I had to. do it, even though the participants were the ones who were actually giving the shock. In that case, they're saying, hey, the situation, the researchers, they overwhelmed my disposition. So I'm really a nice guy, even though I did this thing because the situation required me to. What we found is this: 65%, roughly 2/3 of the people, gave all of the shocks, as opposed to 1% that was predicted. Now this changes in different iterations. So there's different ways that they've done this. So let me show you what this looks like. You see this little dotted line right here? About 2/3 of the people in the original study gave all of the shocks. So these are all the possible shocks that were given. 450 is the top. All the shocks are possibly given. This is the baseline of the original study. A consenting peer. So let's do this whole same study, but let's add some different variables to it. A consenting peer is when there's another teacher in the room with you, that is somebody else who you think is just another participant who consents to the shocks, who says, yeah, we're going to go ahead and give the shocks. In reality, that person's also a confederate. When that happens, a consenting peer, 90% of the actual participants give all the shocks. So remember, when there's just the authority figure in the room, just the authority figure, people gave 2/3. 2/3 of the people gave all the shocks. When there's a consenting peer, meaning when there's somebody else in the room saying, yeah, let's give all the shocks, who you think is just a normal person, 90% of the participants gave all the shocks. What about a dissenting peer? What about somebody who you think is just a normal person, is actually Confederate, who is told to say, no, let's not do this anymore. This is hurting the other person. When you have a dissenting peer, look, these are the dissenting peers. When that happens, only 10% of the actual participant gave all the shocks. The social situation has a big influence. Let's go ahead and do some more. We'll talk about Ash in a minute. When the authority figure, when you have two authority figures in the room instead of just one, and one authority figure is saying keep going, and the other authority figure says no, let's stop. When the other authority figure says no, let's stop, 0 people gave all the shocks. 0 participants gave all the shocks. And the last one have to do with proximity of the actual participants, right? To the person who's receiving the shocks. Now, in reality, nobody got any shocks, just so you know. When the original study was done, this is the red baseline right here, the person receiving the shock is in another room. When the actor who is pretending to receive the shock is in the same room, that's this black line right here. When that's going on, the participants giving all the shocks went way down. I think that's about 40%. However, there's another situation in which the actual learner, teacher, has to put the learner's hand on a shock pad to give them the shocks, actually touch them. When that's going on, we go down to 30%. The emotional distance has a lot to do with it. When you're inflicting harm or pain on somebody, the more distance you can feel, the more likely you are to be aggressive. This is also done through depersonalization. So, for example, in firing squad, we put a hood on or a blindfold. Whenever executions happen, we often do this. Well, it's not, well, for whatever reason people say it's for. One thing it certainly helps is for those who are actually doing the execution, they get to distance themselves and make the person feel a little, more inhuman. And so it's easier for them to engage in an aggressive or even an evil behavior. This is an example of Abu Ghraib prison. So when the United States was invading Iraq, we took over a prison called Abu Ghraib in Baghdad. And this was a very notorious prison because political prisoners were often kept there for Saddam Hussein. Well, we took over, and these are American soldiers, and these are detainees uh, that we Americans arrested. And what we're doing, what these soldiers were doing, was treating them very inhumanely. Well, one way that they did that is by covering their heads, for example, making them less human because we can't see their faces, degrading them by making them walk around naked, etc. This allowed the Americans to emotionally distance themselves from evil or bad behaviors. Sorry, let's talk about one last thing. This is analogous to um, Zimbardo's prison study. The Stanford prison study was a study that was done much earlier than Abu Ghraib happened, in which Stanford students were randomly assigned to be either a prisoner or a guard. And what we saw is that they just started to fall into the roles that they felt like that they should fulfill. And that led to a lot of, very cruel behavior, which included emotionally distancing the guards from the prisoners. They automatically started to do that. One last example with Milgram is Sheridan King in 1972. So some people said of Milgram's studies, hey, I don't think that your studies are really what's going on. I think that people actually knew that this had to be fake. So they didn't really believe that they were shocking anybody. They knew it had to be fake. They were just doing what they thought the researchers wanted them to do, and they knew that this wasn't real. So Sheridan King said, okay, well, let's make it real. We're going to put a puppy in a cage, and on the bottom of that cage is a shock pad. And we're going to do basically the same thing, right? If the dog doesn't respond correctly, we're going to have people shock the puppy for real, a real shock. So consider then, we've got the participants in this study are actual college students. They're college students in this case. And there's 30 switches from 15 volts to 450 volts of electricity. The task that the puppy had to learn was actually impossible. There's no way that the puppy could actually do the task. So the question is, so just so you know, around here, this is when you get a foot flexion, right? So there's a reaction, right, from the dog, and you can see it. Foot flexion, occasional barks, running, and vocalization. So the dog's trying to run away, but it can't because the floor is electric. And in the end, when we get down to here, the final ones, that's continuous barking and howling. So these are actual shocks to an actual puppy who was in the actual room with the college students. So the question that I have for you is, what percent do you think gave all 30 shocks? What percentage of college students would give all 30 shocks to a puppy that is actually receiving the shocks in the same room? Well, let's go ahead and show you the answer. Oh, also, here's the other question. Who is more likely to obey the researcher who's telling them to give the puppy the shocks? So I want you to guess on this one as well. All right. What about you? Would you have shocked the puppy? Go ahead and answer. This is what people have said in the past. Here's the real results. 77% of college students shocked the puppy, all the shocks. Now, we're going to split this. Let's go down. So, orange means that they refused. Yellow means that they lied. So the lie was that they said that the puppy was actually doing the task, and so they didn't have to give him a shock. But in reality, that's a lie because the task was impossible for the puppy to do. When they looked at the actual, behavior, um, when they looked at the behavior, people were obviously uncomfortable with the task of shocking a puppy. But let's look at the breakdown between males and females now. 100% of the females shocked the puppy, all the shocks, compared to only 54% of the males. And this was in 1972, so there are certain gender norms that are going on, et cetera. And I don't want to, say that this is based off of just a gender thing, because that's not what I'm saying. What I am really saying is that even though we think, hey, I am a nice, kind person, I would never do this thing. College students, just like you, when they're put in the correct social situation, do things that they would not think that they would normally do, that are very different from what their personality is. The social situation is very powerful. and often more powerful than you think. All right, let's go ahead and stop there for now, and we'll talk more about it in the second video about chapter 10.